Hi everyone, I'm so glad that you're here. Today we're going to be talking about the creation of knowledge and culture. We spend so much of our lives from the time we arrive on this earth learning about the world we're in, about who we are, who others are, and consuming knowledge around us. And we want to take a moment throughout the course of this class to really focus on how we as human beings don't only consume knowledge, but we create it. And as we create that knowledge and we share it, we have truths, we have understandings, we have values, we have beliefs that we take moving forward, creating both ourselves and the culture that we're in. So this is just a brief overview of what we are going to be looking at throughout this lecture. We're going to begin with myth, legend, and the supernatural. We'll move to scientific inquiry, then positivism and post-positivism, interpretive inquiry, critical inquiry, and post-structural inquiry. Now, this is not going to be a distinct timeline where we move from one means of knowledge creation to another, because all of these continue. They keep going and are all very prevalent in our culture today and could become the foundations of your final project for this course. First, myth, legend, and cultural story. I'm a narrative researcher. I love stories. And if we look through time, stories are how we began to create knowledge and understanding of our world. Across cultures, we have multiple creation stories of how we came to be, how the land forms around us, how the cosmos were formed, how we got here, how we change over time. And in addition to these foundational myth and religious stories that we have, we also have shared cultural narratives that matter to us, narratives of freedom, narratives of self-sufficiency, narratives of familial culture and connection. Even if you think back to the stories in your family that we tell and we retell, and that's how we identify what it means to be a member of our family. I know my family is Italian American, and I am the second generation born in this country. And the idea that my grandmother at 16 came across the ocean to marry someone she had never knew because she believed in a better life was a foundational story that moved our family forward, reflecting back to the immigrant and American narrative. Now, is that story romanticized? Is it co-constructed? Is it changed over time? Yes, as do our myths that we share together. Myths of freedom and opportunity become problematized over time. So you might be interested in that idea of how we create those cultural stories and how those cultural stories become shared personal stories that we tell and retell. Scientific inquiry. Now, around the Renaissance, people started being interested in being able to conduct a systematic analysis of the world around them. They began digging up bodies that were buried, even though the church told them not to be able to experiment. They began looking more systematically in how we could study the sky and the land around us. We started to understand this idea of creating a hypothesis and creating a question that we could observe and measure and then predict outcomes. And we still have that foundation of scientific inquiry today. It starts as young as kindergarten or even preschool. Our children are asked to make a hypothesis, test it, and see if it's true. Our scientists do this, and whatever truth happens is only created by a new scientific discovery and a new hypothesis that is tested and proven over time. Now, does this mean that myth and narrative are gone? Of course not. Those persist as well, sometimes in opposition, sometimes parallel, sometimes they meld together, but we have this idea of the hypothesis that we test with a measurable outcome is the foundation of scientific inquiry and the creation of knowledge. So we move to positivism, post-positivism and capital T truth? Well, as time went on in the 1830s, there began to be this idea that if we can know how atoms move, if we can know how life forms evolve over time, and we can predict outcomes of what is going to happen in the natural world around us, we should be able to also predict it with human behavior. And so they tried to set up this scientific inquiry, and there was this belief that yes, human beings can be as predictable as atoms. Over time, we found out that just wasn't true. There's very few social scientists that are really pure positivists anymore. But that's where we get post-positivism. Yes, at our core, human beings behave irrationally sometimes. We do things that don't make sense, but with very rigorous, careful testing through observation and through different sorts of data that we can collect via quantitative analysis means we can perhaps predict very closely what will happen. You'll think of when something is statistically significant, it's a 0.05 chance that it could be wrong. There's going to be people who are not going to fall into this particular finding, but that overall it does predict the majority of people's feelings, beliefs, perceptions, or behaviors. Now, let's move to interpretive inquiry, especially in the 1940s. So there's always had been a bit of a pushback against positivism and post-positivism, and this idea that human beings are individuals, each living through a unique body in a unique time, space, cultural location, and we can't predict or deeply know with a capital T truth what it means to be that person. But through careful listening, we can get to know them better. We can understand their lived experience and empathize with them, understand them, be able to articulate and co-create understanding with them. And also the idea that if enough people are living through similar bodies in similar locations, they can have similar experiences. My first study that I conducted was an interpretive study on women living with bulimia. And all the women I interviewed were white, between the ages of 18 and 25, and middle class, and there was a lot of consistent themes that came out of their lived experience. So interpretive inquiry will say we can never truly know or predict, but that's not what we want to do. We want to understand, and the more stories we hear, the more complex, deep understanding with reemergent themes we can have around what it means to be human. So an interpretive researcher does not go in with a hypothesis to test. They go in with a phenomenon they really want to understand. Now, critical inquiry. Critical inquiry and interpretive inquiry, and at times even post-positive inquiry, can overlap with one another. These aren't always distinct. But I want to move from critical inquiry to say that there was this question of, it's not just that different bodies have different experiences in the world that we should try to neutrally understand. It's the idea that different bodies have different experiences based on the amount of power their body has. And so there becomes the question of a white person has more cultural power, opportunities in society than a person of color, and therefore is going to respond in a different way. The same way a cisgender male body versus a cisgender female body versus a non-binary body, there is this idea of what body we're in and how culture reads us, and the amount of power and persuasion we have in that culture to craft our own movement through space is going to change our lived experience. The idea that if you are a person who has a disability and is trying to become what is considered a productive member in capitalist culture, there can be pushback there. There can be this idea you are not self-sufficient enough. If you are a woman and a position is seen as something that is classically male, if people read your body as queer, if they read your body as non-conformative in different ways, there can be ways that your body can be punished for that. It can be ostracized for that. Different opportunities can be taken away And critical inquiry uncovers that phenomenon as it happens, at how power is used to give some people unearned benefits and marginalize other people. And in that way, when we look through a critical perspective, we can watch this at work, know that it's not natural, know that it's culturally constructed, and we can push back. We can think it's a critical inquiry creates the civil rights movement, creates the women's rights movement, creates the LGBT rights movement. This is the way, the ability movement. It makes these different ways for us to understand how power is moving and to work towards a more equitable world. And the final means of knowing that I want to discuss with you is post-structural inquiry. And post-structural inquiry is also interested in power like critical inquiry, but at the core of a post-structural question is the foundational understanding that knowledge, identity, meaning, and power are fluid, fragile, and always moving. Now, there can be power structures that are deeply ingrained in our culture, so ingrained that they feel natural, that that's how it has always been, to the point where people have used scientific inquiry to argue that there are just innate differences between groups that means one group should be in power over others. But that those constructions are by people, and they can also be deconstructed. That every human encounter we have gives us a chance to reiterate, resist, dismantle, and recreate cultural meanings. And as we do that, as we move together as human beings in this ongoing, forever unfinished creation of knowledge, culture, and identity, we can have entire shifts over what is considered natural and understood and innate. Think about how much we understood about transgender identity 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Think of in the 1930s, a woman wearing pants surprised people. People weren't sure what to say when they saw it. Now it's very natural. We move through culture now, and again, what it means to display femininity and masculinity become questioned. We now understand non-binary identity, where if we go a decade back, nobody could ever think of us not having a binary sexes as a broad cultural understanding that is everywhere, from our mass-produced media to our interpersonal interactions. So post-structural inquiry is aware of that vulnerability and highlights it, and is interested in investigating how it shifts and it moves and changes over time. Is post-structural inquiry sometimes very critical? Of course. Can it have an interpretive part? Of course it can. It can also be grounded in some ideas of what we know to be human through scientific inquiry. So, as we move through this course, remember, the question you have about the world dictates the method you are drawn to find understanding. So think of, what paradigm am I coming from? What methods come from that paradigm? And we're going to learn that throughout the course, that I can then be able to ask a question and I can test it to find an answer. I can do critical reflection and find an answer. I can ask and develop understanding. I can look at how power is forming and dismantled. All of those different things can happen. It starts with the question you ask. And know that how you share it can be in all different ways. It can be a published research report. It can be a human interest story. It's through social media posts, artistic exhibits, performance. There are lots of ways to share knowledge, and how you share knowledge depends on what you've created. And note that those different artifacts will attract a different audience. And finally, I want you to remember that what frame and methods you use depends on the questions you have. So I want you to think of, what questions about being human, about the world do you have? Those questions are going to fall within a paradigm, or they might fall between paradigms, and that'll help you construct a question and a method to develop understanding. Once you develop your question, you go through your method. No, there's lots of different ways to share your results. Some people want to share it through a story they write, a human interest piece. Some want to make social media posts, artistic exhibits, performances, and sometimes a classic research report. There's lots of different ways, lots of different artifacts that can come in your journey to produce knowledge. And those different artifacts speak to different audiences. And we'll talk about how to choose the message you have for the people you want to share it with. I'm really excited to go through this semester with you, and I'll talk to you soon. Don't forget to take the quiz at the end of this unit.